Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, it's been a kind of rough stretch for me. The neck injury that I got a couple of weeks ago, which I think I mentioned, that turned a lot worse in the past week, and it led to my finally getting to a doctor yesterday. He diagnosed cervical radiculopathy, which I heard as radiculopathy, and asked if he was just making shit up. Turns out that's a pinched nerve. I still got to go in and get an x-ray done and make sure there's nothing else floating around in there. But I'm now on naproxen and a muscle relaxant, which is groovy. But since one of my symptoms through all this has been dizziness, it's not exactly helping me figure out if I'm getting better. The doctor also freaked out when he was asking me what I'd been taking for the pain. I mentioned ibuprofen, and he was trying to get me to say how often, what dose, etc. And I told him, I don't know, I've taken it maybe 3-4 times. And he just kind of paused. He's like, you can take more than that. It's pain. You shouldn't be dealing with it on your own. But I am a sponge for pain, and I've always operated under the principle that if I'm masking it, then I won't know it's there, and I might do something that ends up making things worse. Which, yes, you could probably take as a metaphor of some kind for my life, but it is definitely a good intro for this week's show. You see, my guest this time is the writer and therapist Donald J. Robertson, who has a new book out today, which is February 6, 2024, for you time travelers out there. It is called Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic Emperor. It's from Yale University Press as part of their Ancient Lives series. And it is this really well-crafted, concise exploration of Marcus Aurelius's life, the ancient Roman emperor, fusing records that were contemporary with him and biographies that were done, during and after his life, and other ancient sources with a lot more modern scholarship. And Donald really manages to evoke both the times and the man over the course of just 200 pages. Of course, a key source anytime you're doing something like this is the Meditations, Marcus Aurelius's notes on Stoic philosophy and his life. And Donald does a great job of showing how Marcus learned about Stoicism, incorporated it into his life, and then used it, to cope with a really rough hand as Emperor of Rome. Well, the book's primarily a well-researched and well-told biography, but the philosophic journey is absolutely fascinating. And I think Donald's right, as he'll say during the show, that you really can't tell Marcus Aurelius's story without the story of Stoicism, how it plays into his life, how it gets there to begin with, and how well he's able to integrate it. And Donald also in the book gets into what Stoicism is and isn't. And when we talk about it in the show, we're going to refer to it as capital S Stoicism, as opposed to the lowercase version, which I attribute to a lot of bro culture and toxic masculinity guys. So Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic Emperor, it's a wonderful read. It really brings the complexities of Rome to life. The power dynamics, the external threats, the internal threats, the family, the adoptive families, the natural families, everything that goes into showing us not just how a philosopher king lived, but how we each can live and handle the adversities the world presents us with, whether they're large or small. I should also add, I'm really glad to see the Yale Ancient Lives series rolling along. I think this is the 7th or 8th book in that, and I recorded with Peter Stoddard for his Crassus book in 2022, which I think was the first or second book in the Ancient Lives series. So congrats. Anyway, here's Donald's bio from the book, and there's a more extensive one at his website. Donald J. Robertson, a cognitive behavior psychotherapist and writer, is a founding member of the organization Modern Stoicism and the president and founder of the Plato's Academy Center nonprofit. He is the author of How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, the Stoic Philosophy of Marcus Aurelius, Verissimus, a graphic novel biography of Marcus, and Stoicism and the Art of Happiness. He lives in Canada and Greece. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Donald J. Robertson.
Well, it's a great, in a way you've got your own private university. It's like, Benjamin Disraeli, the British Prime Minister, said the best way to learn about a subject is to write a book about it. And you can imagine all the stuff that you're learning about just by interviewing all these different authors. It's a fantastic, you'll look back on it years from now and think of like how it's changed you.
Oh gosh, I do that all the time. I can't, and we're recording now. I'm going to probably keep this part in because it feeds right into what we're going to talk about. There's that question I've had of what would I have been reading had I not been doing this since 2012? And I don't think I would have learned, a smidge, intellectually curious as I am, I would not have been exposed to it as much as I have been just from the sheer number of publicist emails and connections like the one I just mentioned, just people saying, you need to sit down with this person. And even the person who made that reference, we only connected on his first biography, which was about the tailor Tommy Nutter from the 60s and 70s. Who I knew nothing about, but somehow came across this guy in his book about this off the wall Savile Row tailor and thought, I want to learn more about that. And again, that's how this huge profusion of knowledge goes for me. In fact, there's a book I've been meaning to get back to in reference to Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic Emperor, by, Elizabeth Lash Quinn, called Ars Vitae, The Fate of Inwardness and the Return of the Ancient Arts of Living, where she cites a bunch of different schools of ancient thought and how they translate into the present. I meant to get to it, at least the Stoic chapter, before sitting down with you, but,
I was going to say, I haven't heard of that book. I might need to check it out.
I'll zap you a link. The other interesting book that comes out the same day as yours, Pax Romana, about the plague that hit
that's awesome.
Yeah, I came across that yesterday. I'm like, what are the odds?
A good title.
I know that the title got me first, but I was just, what are the odds? Both of those are coming out the same day. But, thanks to your book, I get a little better understanding of that one going in, or it was enough to catch my eye when I saw a link to that in a RSS feed.
Well, maybe Marcus Aurelius is it about the Antonine Plague? It's about the plague in the time of Marcus.
Yeah, it's about that.
That's
and then
amazing.
There's the subsequent ones and the bubonic one from a couple hundred years later, but particularly starting with the Antonine Plague and what it meant, how it affected empire, basically, and whether it demonstrated, I think from the description I read of it, whether it demonstrated flaws in the empire as it stood before this hit. And of course, I guess there's what does that have to teach us about, what we're going through ourselves? God, history. Anyway, as I was about to say,
history is the future.
That's what I keep learning from doing. That's why I've been interviewing so many more nonfiction than fiction writers in the last bunch of years, just because I'm picking up more of those resonances as they go by. But this is your fourth book about Marcus Aurelius, right?
Third.
Ish.
Fourth, 3.5.
Okay.
Let's say 3.5, because I edited and I wrote an introduction to an edition of the Meditations. So I don't normally count that, but let's call it 3.5.
So what was it like approaching him as a biographical subject, as opposed to strictly a philosophic one?
Well, actually, It's a bit of both. Like the first book I wrote was called How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, and I would say it was a self-help book. But in every chapter, it's got a little kind of biographical anecdote. And then I wrote a graphic novel called Verissimus about him, which is about his life. So it's biographical as well. And then I wrote this biography. And, so the question that some people have asked me is, how can you write a biography? Aren't you kind of redoing some of the stuff that you've done before? But somehow I think it turned out quite different. And I think doing the graphic novel actually helped me immensely because it made it easier for me to really try and visualize. I think one of the big challenges of writing biography is to kind of get beyond the sort of abstract, kind of chopping words from ancient texts and really try and imagine yourself in the situation, kind of like start describing the sounds and the smells and the experiences and what certain things imply about people's situations and behaviors and so on. And that was easier because I'd done the graphic novel. But the biography, there are also quite a few biographies, funnily enough, of Marcus Aurelius. I mean, people can just read the ancient biographies that survive. There are 3 by Cassius Dio, Herodian, and in the Historia Augusta. But there's a lot of other stuff that we can add to that and a lot of interpretation and analysis that we can do. But there's quite a few modern biographies. So another question was, well, why do another biography if there already are some? And I thought, the funny thing is the modern biographies didn't satisfy me in terms of how they address his philosophy. I say in the introduction, it would be like someone writing a biography of St. Augustine or someone like that and just not really mentioning the role that Christianity played in his life. It's kind of unthinkable. But people write about Marcus Aurelius and they talk about the wars and things like that and don't really explain how Stoicism shaped his decisions as emperor.
And what was it like for you in that respect, sort of squaring the biography with, what you've, we'll say, learned or integrated of Stoicism over the years? Yeah, how much did one inform the other? I get, which is diving way deep into your approach to him and everything. But let's go on the deep dive.
Let's do a bit of a deep dive. It really changed the way that I went about it. I think in some ways I was lucky. It was relatively easy for me to write this book. And there's other books, the book that I've written subsequently I found harder. But I was so immersed in Marcus Aurelius, and there's a kind of relatively limited amount of source material that I kind of knew fairly inside out. So it gave me more freedom to really do the creative work of writing biography and put more time and effort into really trying to imagine myself in his shoes and describe things a little bit more creatively and vividly in a sort of narrative style. So you get more academic biographies that will say, well, we've got one source that says this and another source that says that, and it may or may not be true, and this one contradicts that one. But those aren't as much fun for the average reader to read, whereas this biography is written in a more narrative style. It's a little bit more like a movie screenplay. It's meant for the average Joe to be able to pick it up and read it like a story. So we have to simplify things a little bit. Sometimes we have to kind of speculate a little bit to make the narrative flow. But hopefully it's more engaging, and it is an interesting story about Marcus's life. And I hope that comes across to people. And I hope that when they read it, although it's not a self-help book, I hope that they read it and come away from it with at least 1 or 2 concepts or techniques even that might be helpful to them in their daily lives. I found Stoicism very, very helpful in my own life. And as my background, I did a degree in philosophy originally, and then I trained as a psychotherapist and counsellor. So my career wasn't in academia, it was in clinical practice. But I've always combined the two things. And as a therapist, I really found Stoicism immensely helpful to me personally, and then also to some extent with my clients. So I hope that people read that book and it inspires them to go and read the Meditations if they haven't already, or that they also maybe just take 1 or 2 ideas mentioned in the book and maybe find them helpful in daily life.
We'll dive back into Marcus Aurelius, but let's talk about Stoicism with a capital S versus the lowercase s, which you make the difference early on in the book, because it's something that we see a lot of what I like to call the lowest college denominator of people kind of taking what they think are the key values or greatest hits, or degrading what's actually there. We see a lot of it in bro culture, especially with lowercase stoicism and the Roman Empire and all these things they've glommed onto, which all feels like that's seen in a Fish Called Wanda, where Jamie Lee Curtis calls out Kevin Kline for misrepresenting all the ancient philosophers as badly as he does. But can you speak a little about...
The London Underground, he thought was a political movement and things like that. I remember. I've seen that. I remember that movie.
Yeah, it's just this one scene where she finally just unloads on him. I finally went to a library and I figured out, but yeah, that sense of what is capital S Stoicism and sort of how do you see it in contrast to this lowercase sort of debased version, which I know debased is a pejorative term to throw on it, but what the hell?
It's fair enough. It wasn't such a thing even a couple of years ago, actually. I really think it's taken off a lot. It's been around, for a long time, but I think it's taken off over the past couple of years. And I guess I was less critical of it before, and everyone else seemed to be saying to me, Stoicism was getting degraded, and people seemed more annoyed about it than I was. I've still got kind of mixed feelings about it. But I guess recently I've started to think, okay, yeah, it's gone a little bit far now with people. There are people who I know who have written books about Stoicism who have never read the Stoics. That's unbelievable, but it's true. There was pretty famous influencer who asked me to write video scripts for him to read about Stoicism because he wasn't into it and hadn't really studied it. But his audience were, and I said no. So there are people who want to. Definitely, there are people who just literally want to. There are people who just want to jump on the bandwagon and kind of cash in on Stoicism, who don't understand it and kind of maybe misrepresent it quite badly. And the most common way that happens all over the internet is that people confuse Stoicism, the Greek philosophy, which was a big, complicated philosophical tradition that existed for about 500 years in the ancient world. They confuse that with lowercase Stoicism, which is the modern concept of an unemotional coping style. I could define it in a slightly abrupt way by saying that lowercase Stoicism is a coping style that consists in suppressing or concealing unpleasant or embarrassing emotions. So we sometimes just describe it as having a stiff upper lip. And the thing is, it's based on a very simplistic idea of emotion, that emotion is just a kind of blob of energy or something. So you're anxious or afraid or you're sad, and that's just a kind of blob of feeling, and you should somehow kind of like try and either suppress that or kind of vent it or something, as if it builds up pressure and things. Whereas the Stoics had a more nuanced understanding of emotion that would, 2,500 years ago, 2,300 years ago, they had a more nuanced view than that. And they said, look, emotions are like anxiety, depression. It's like a cake that's baked from many ingredients. It's like a watch with moving parts. It's not just a kind of homogeneous blob. And so the Stoics would say there are involuntary and voluntary aspects of anxiety and depression. Then we have to distinguish between those. There are cognitive aspects of emotion. We need to identify those. So if you suppress your anxiety or anger, or you channel it in the gym, the one thing that you're potentially not doing is identifying the underlying beliefs and attitudes that made you angry in the first place, and maybe changing those, or challenging them, or questioning them. And that's really what the Stoics wanted people to do. And the reason it's very important to maintain this distinction is that there's a body of research, a significant body of research, a number of independent studies that really converge on the conclusion that lowercase Stoicism, which we can measure using a number of different tools. One is, for example, the Liverpool Stoicism Scale. There's a number of validated measures, several that we use. The studies converge in the finding that lowercase Stoicism is unhealthy. And ironically, people believe that suppressing unpleasant or painful emotions is a kind of sign of toughness, or sometimes they view it as something that's kind of masculine to do. But in a sense, it's the opposite. It's weak. It makes you less resilient emotionally. So trying to be a tough guy in the long run, it turns out, is actually going to make you more fragile psychologically. And I think this paradox is something that people should be more aware of. If you want to be tough, this is not the way to do it. You're not even achieving that. And so we know that low-key stoicism is basically bad for your mental health, whereas capitalist stoicism is the inspiration for modern cognitive behavioral therapy, which we know is good for your mental health. So you wouldn't want to mix up something that's bad for your mental health with something that's good for your mental health, basically. And yet all over the internet, influencers like, and I'll pick one that I think it's probably a safe bet we can mention as a bad example. Andrew Tate has a video about how he's really into Marcus Aurelius, allegedly. Although I'm not convinced there's any evidence in the video that he's read Marcus Aurelius, right? But nevertheless, he says it's an influence on him. And his version of Stoicism bears no resemblance to Stoic philosophy at all, and is really quite contrary to what the Stoics would have taught. It's about suppressing or venting emotion rather than actually understanding how emotion works in a more sophisticated way that would give us some kind of foothold or leverage to do something more therapeutic with our feelings.
And that's, again, fitting right into the Kevin Kline vibe I was talking about earlier, unfortunately, which again shows that history doesn't just repeat, it rhymes poorly. But tell me about if you remember, your introduction to Marcus Aurelius and to Stoicism.
Yeah. I started getting into Marcus Aurelius, funnily enough. I didn't think of this at first, but someone pointed out to me that there are some kind of vague similarities between Marcus's background and mine. So Marcus's father died when he was 3 or 4 years old. My father died when I was about 13. And Marcus kind of turned to Stoicism, and I did the same thing. When my father passed away, he was a Freemason, which I should explain that Freemasonry originated in Scotland. And in my town in Scotland, most of my friends' fathers were Freemasons. And it provided my father with a kind of philosophy of life, in a way. It was a kind of a sort of mixture of Hellenistic philosophy and sort of Old Testament Christianity. And he left his books behind, and I read them. I couldn't make head nor tail of them, except that I noticed they mentioned things like the 4 cardinal virtues of Greek philosophy: wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. And there were names like Plato and Pythagoras in there. And that just intrigued me. And I started reading Plato when I was like 15 or 16 or something like that. And reading a lot of books about world religions and kind of esoteric stuff, Gnosticism, the Kabbalah. And I got deeper and deeper into philosophy. I went to university and I studied philosophy. And by the time I graduated, I really was into meditation. I was interested in Freud and Jung and psychoanalysis and philosophy. I wanted to help people by learning about some kind of therapy. I wanted to help myself by learning some kind of self-improvement, meditation, self-hypnosis technique or something like that. And I wanted some kind of philosophy of life as, I think, a replacement for a father figure. I as some kind of guide for how to go about living my life. And I wasn't getting that from my degree in philosophy. And then after I graduated, I started to train as a therapist. And I stumbled across the Stoics, who are one of the few schools of ancient philosophy that are not normally covered in an undergraduate philosophy curriculum. And the reason for that, my academic friends tell me, is they'll say, well, the Stoics didn't really come up with many original ideas. They're borrowing ideas from Plato and Aristotle and other earlier thinkers to a large extent. But what the Stoics really do is develop how you would apply those ideas to daily life in order to improve your life. And then my academic friends would say, so why would anybody want to study that? And I thought, well, that's exactly what I want to study.
And that's exactly why they're studying, in academia.
Right? What do you do? Yeah, what do you do with these ideas? How do they actually help you? And I realized that cognitive behavioral therapy was inspired by Stoicism. And so I really suddenly, it was a strange thing because I felt very lost as a young guy. And I felt like I was spinning lots of plates, trying to find something. And then when I discovered the Stoics, it was like an epiphany, everything crystallized. I remember joking to myself, I don't need to read Heidegger and Freud and books on Buddhism and stuff anymore. I can just read Seneca and that's it. It'd be a lot easier. Like, I have a much smaller library to focus on. And I thought maybe this is a fad. But that was about 25 years ago, and I'm still into Stoicism. So I think it just did really click with me. It gave me all of these things I wanted combined into one, basically. The way I got into it more specifically was that I had studied Gnosticism because, you know, kind of esoteric.
Part of the mystic traditions you were looking at. Yeah. And the Nag Hammadi library in particular, which is like a, what is it, 2nd, 3rd century AD corpus of a kind of apocryphal Gnostic Christian text that was found in Egypt, I was very interested in. And those are very influenced by Neoplatonic philosophy. In a weird parallel universe, Socrates is in the Bible. Let me explain. The community at Nag Hammadi had their own codices or Bibles with Christian scriptures in them. So they had things like the Gospel of Thomas and so on. And in one of them, they have an excerpt from Plato's Republic, which features Socrates. So this Christian community had a Bible, a kind of proto-Bible, that has Socrates in it. Weird. That's like something out of fan fiction or a parallel universe, right? There's an alternative history where Socrates is in the Bible. It could have been like... So that kind of got me... I got interested in that, and then I forgot about it, and I went to university. I left university, and I thought, this existentialism and whatnot, and Wittgenstein, it's not really helping me in my life. And I thought Gnosticism kind of somehow seemed more like a spiritual path to me. And I went back, and I thought I'd read that again. And I read a French scholar called Pierre Hadot's book on Plotinus, The Simplicity of Vision. And I loved it so much, I thought, you know, when you get an album by a band, and you think, this band are amazing. I've been sleeping on these guys. Like, I'm gonna buy all of their albums. Like, so I got all of Pierre Hadot's books and I read them. And he talks in particular about spiritual exercises in ancient philosophy, and I loved that. It was like the meditation techniques and therapy techniques that I was interested in. And Pierre Hadot casts the net quite wide, and he talks about Hellenistic philosophy in general. But I really noticed that of all the different schools of philosophy, the one that placed the most emphasis on the stuff I was interested in and the kind of psychological meditation exercises and the use of philosophy as a therapy was the Stoics. And that really got me then, that channeled me towards reading Seneca and Marcus Aurelius and so on. Was there resistance in the therapy world when you were kind of bringing these ideas in, or is that enough of a...
There was a mixture of apathy and resistance. Mm-hmm. So I thought the first book I ever wrote, well, first of all, like, maybe this is an interesting story, right? I never did my PhD because, and I like kind of dining out in this story, mm-hmm. Like, I did my master's degree, and I graduated top of my year at university. Everybody thought I was a shoo-in to go on and be an academic and stuff. I couldn't find anyone to supervise my PhD thesis because I couldn't find any university departments that were interested in Stoicism, and definitely not interested in Stoicism and therapy. I couldn't even find departments that did PhDs in psychotherapy theory that were interested in Stoicism and psychotherapy. So I gave up. And I decided I'll just write a book about it because I already had my notes from my PhD thesis. So instead of going to university, I kind of hit a brick wall. I thought I'll just get it published. And that was how I became a writer, out of frustration in a way. And so I wrote a book called The Philosophy of CBT. I wrote that maybe 12 years ago or something. And it was intended for an audience of psychologists and academics. But it did pretty well. But it was not read by them. It was read by laypersons, like a general readership, as a kind of self-help book. So it was odd. It wasn't the intended audience that got into it. And then after that, I guess that funneled me into writing books that were more aimed at a general readership. So there was initially... So there's the kind of Freudian psychoanalytic tradition in therapy who many of whom don't like Stoicism because they believe that any kind of attempt to directly change desires or emotions is going to repress the underlying psychosexual drives that cause them. So Freud this might be a little bit of a caricature of Freud, but not that much of a caricature. So Freud might have said, well, you can't go around you can't go around challenging your beliefs in order to get rid of your anxiety, because anxiety is caused by repressed castration anxiety. So you're going to still have the underlying castration anxiety, and it'll just come through in a different form, was what Freud believed. Hardly anyone believes that anymore, because research studies have generally shown that that doesn't happen. Freud called it symptom substitution. He said if you get rid of a symptom, like depression or anxiety or a habit, you don't deal with the underlying, what he believed was the underlying Oedipus complex, then you'll just get other symptoms in the future. That doesn't happen. He was wrong. But nevertheless, psychoanalytic therapists would have said, oh, we're not touching Stoicism for that reason. So after a long time, the field changed and cognitive behavioral therapy come along, which does address symptoms directly and didn't find evidence of that sort of symptom substitution happening. And so cognitive behavioral therapy lent some validation to Stoicism, right? But there was still, when I started 25 years ago, psychoanalytic therapists that would have said, no, for, their, I guess, ideological or theoretical reasons we're against this. Now, cognitive behavioral therapists were against it for a kind of different reason that surprised me, but it should have been obvious. In CBT, there's a lot of emphasis on being evidence-based and studying the latest research literature. And so there are two issues there. One is that cognitive behavioral therapists are kind of too busy reading other stuff to go off and read Marcus Aurelius in many cases. Not in all cases, but they kind of think, no, I've spent all my time reading research studies. I haven't got time to go off and start learning about classics, is how some of them might see it. And then the other thing is there's a little bit of a kind of aversion to anything that's old, because being evidence-based generally means that you're looking at the most recent stuff.
Sure.
And you view things with suspicion if they're a little bit old or if they're not directly supported by evidence. So there's a little bit of a kind of cultural aversion towards it. And I thought at first, wrongly, that cognitive behavioral therapists would get more into Stoicism. And I started off mainly speaking at therapy conferences and writing in therapy journals and magazines. The first article I wrote about Stoicism was in the Journal of the British Association for Counselling, for example. And somehow along the way that just stopped, and I kind of moved on to a different audience because these therapists weren't really that interested. But what's happened over time is that now, after 20 odd years, I hear therapists saying, I'm thinking about getting into Stoicism. And I'll say, why is that? What's got you into it? And they'll say, because several of my clients have mentioned it to me. And that makes perfect sense to me. I was like, of course, if people tell them you should read Stoicism, they'll think, well, I've got better things to do with my time and I'm not into old stuff. I'm not saying all cognitive, but a lot of them seem to say that.
Yeah.
However, if their clients ask them about it and the clients say Stoicism is connected with CBT, it almost embarrasses them a little bit into thinking, gee, I better go and read up on that then. So in a roundabout way and belatedly, I think psychotherapists are getting more into Stoicism.
It's interesting because I was reading a paper of yours, I think from 2019, sort of about the increase in well, we'll say mindfulness and other aspects of living that are coming out through therapy, and how they're translated through sort of Eastern and Buddhist principles. And it struck me as one of those, it's okay if it's exotic and Eastern, as opposed to something that was in front of us all along, as history of Western civilization goes. That it's less embarrassing to look far afield than to have overlooked something that was sitting in our backyard all this time. I
think you're right. Sometimes Buddhists get quite angry with me, ironically, because I'll say, people really, really think of mindfulness and some of these other practices as being very Buddhist in nature. But we already had them. For a start, the word mindfulness is an English word, obviously, and it existed before anyone was really studying Buddhism. But the concept of mindfulness is in Stoicism. It's in early Christianity as well. The Greek word for it is prosoche, which means paying attention to your mind, basically. And it's a technique in Stoic philosophy. And many of the other kind of cliches that we have, I mean, you could even say that in order to understand Buddhism, without realizing we're doing it, we translate it into Western concepts and terminology and metaphors and cliches. Even the expression here and now is derived from Latin. And it's a concept that existed in medieval philosophy in the West. So we already have a tradition that's focused on the here and now and on mindfulness and on non-attachment. It was kind of eclipsed in some ways by Christian thought. And then people just seem to completely forget about it and lose touch with it. And then they discover it again in Buddhism. I studied Buddhism at university. I studied history of Buddhism and history of Indian philosophy as part of my philosophy degree. And I used to go on Buddhist retreats. I even have a Buddhist tattoo from my younger days. But I was thinking Buddhism offered me a philosophy of life, but I always felt it was too exotic in a way. There were bits of it that I felt I didn't understand. I felt that the Western Buddhists were kind of sanitizing. I mean, when I studied Buddhism at university...
But yeah, that same vibe of making it palatable somehow, yeah.
I think what highlighted that to me was that because I studied Buddhism at university, they made us actually study the Buddhist scriptures in a more objective way. And then at the same time, I was going to Buddhist classes, and I thought the Buddhism you guys are teaching me is kind of different from what these scriptures actually say. And it seems to me that you've put a Western spin on it, and you've kind of left out the less palatable bits, and you've kind of polished up some of the other bits, which is fine. But just from a historical perspective, your Buddhism is different, a little bit different from the original Buddhism, and also was probably a bit different from Buddhism as it exists. And I also met a number of Buddhist monks from different countries. And it was always a little bit of an awkward experience because the Buddhist monks' idea of Buddhism was, I noticed, often somewhat at odds with the idea of Buddhism that the students had in the Buddhist Society in Aberdeen. And there's nothing inherently wrong about that, but it didn't really sit that comfortably with me.
Yeah.
And so when I found Stoicism, I thought it somehow felt more consistent with my cultural norms and values. And I had a kind of deja vu feeling about it. I'll tell you, one of the weird reasons, just incidentally, as a kind of side note, I grew up in Ayr in Scotland, which is the home of Robert Burns, or Robbie Burns, our national bard, the guy who wrote Auld Lang Syne. And he's a kind of folk hero almost in Scotland. And they made us read Burns's poetry at school. And Burns was friends with a professor of philosophy at Glasgow University called Dugald Stewart, who was an expert on Stoicism. And Burns, I think, had also read Latin poetry, which is infused with Stoic and Epicurean ideas. And so through Burns's poetry, I thought, some of these ideas are kind of strangely familiar to me. There's little fragments of them. Burns says, in his most famous poem, Tam O'Shanter, pleasures are like poppies spread. You seize the flower, its bloom is shed. Or like the snow falls in the river, a moment white, then melts forever. Now, that's a literary cliche. It's a trope that occurs in poetry throughout the ages about the transience of pleasure and the impermanence of material things. But the idea that we have to find that in Buddhism is kind of bizarre because it's quite common in Western literature. And so I'd kind of come across that, but I hadn't thought of it as a philosophy of life from reading it in poetry and stuff. And then I found the Stoics, and I thought, hang on a minute, these poets that mention contemplating their own mortality and reflecting on the impermanence of things and, visualizing our life within a wider context, the bigger picture. And so these kind of literary tropes derive from an actual philosophy of life that resembles yoga or Buddhism or something like that. And that was a revelation to me.
When it comes, though, to talking to patients, how much, how much can you expect them to know, I guess? I know this will sound weird, but, how much are you, do you have to translate, these things? And never having been in therapy, although I clearly need it, don't know how deeply that interaction goes, what you're bringing to them and whether there's homework, as it were.
Well, like in my early days as a therapist, I didn't talk to patients or clients that much about stoicism. There's at least particularly in CBT or in other types of therapy as well, the therapist has to maintain neutrality. And that would mean the therapist has to be really careful not to indoctrinate the client into a particular set of assumptions or values. A good therapist will remain neutral in that way. And it's actually hard to do that. There are subtle ways that you might be doing that without realizing it. So I wouldn't sit clients down and say, hey, have you ever thought about agreeing with Stoicism? Stoicism's got this kind of ethic that's therapeutic. And that's the paradox, that because it's an ethical system, and I think in a sense it's more fundamental, that's what makes it more of a philosophy of life than CBT. But to teach clients that would be potentially like teaching them Marxism or Christianity or Buddhism or something like that. It kind of goes beyond the remit of a therapist, and it raises issues for therapist neutrality. So I didn't really, unless the client brought Stoicism up, I didn't mention it to them much, but I would use Stoicism in my own life to help me integrate CBT and make better use of it myself. Over time, though, in all honesty, once I began writing and talking about Stoicism, it reached a point where you might as well forget about using me as a kind of representative sample, because my clients exhibited profound selection bias.
Yeah, I was going to say,
and almost all of them
suddenly
were into, they're all people that are into Stoicism. Yeah. So I thought, these are not normal clients. Like they've all seen me talking about it online. So now all the people that are into Stoicism come to see me. Virtually none of them would come to see me after a while that didn't read about Stoicism or weren't interested in it. And now Stoicism is so well known that kind of biases them in a sense even more. But I think really that, like I said, there's a paradox there that there are limitations on what a therapist can do. You're in a consulting room, generally one-to-one with the client, though sometimes as a group. That's much less common. And, normally you don't really talk to clients about their whole philosophy of life. Normally what you do is time limited, at least in CBT. It's for a few weeks or months. But Stoicism is permanent. It's a philosophy of life that you do ongoing for the rest of your life, like a yoga or a religion or something like that. And so the very fact that it doesn't fit neatly into a consulting room setting is actually one of its greatest strengths. Because the holy grail of psychotherapy would be something that we call emotional resilience. And by emotional resilience, we mean prevention. So emotional resilience would be building up people's character so they were less likely in the long-term future to develop psychological problems like depression and anxiety disorders. If you could get them when they're young, like get school kids, and train them in emotional resilience, maybe you could save a whole generation from by reducing the risk of mental health problems. Because prevention in medicine is always better than cure. Therapists are Johnny-come-lately on the scene. It's too late. The client's already depressed, and now we have to kind of dig them out of this hole. But what if we could prevent them falling into the hole in the first place? And I think Stoicism is particularly of interest as a form of emotional resilience building rather than just therapy, because it's deeper and broader in scope. And one of the problems with resilience building, we know that CBT therapy type techniques can be useful, but they don't last that long. So if you get a bunch of kids and you teach them thinking skills and communication skills and stuff like that, it will benefit them for a couple of years. And then the benefits kind of wear off unless they do booster sessions and they're trained in it again. People, often when people learn healthy skills, they use them for a while and then eventually they fade and they stop using them. So the Holy Grail would be to find something that people get into and stay into permanently, or at least long term. And Stoicism seems to have that, promise. People who get into Stoicism tend to remain into it. Like when people get into Buddhism or yoga, sometimes it's a fad, but in many cases it's a lifelong thing. And that's important because it being a lifelong thing is probably the key to building permanent psychological resilience.
What would training look like? It's a weird question, but if you were, again, putting this sort of program in place or way of educating and inculcating, what would ongoing practice look like for not a patient, but a person or child even to take home?
Someone training in emotional resilience, right? First of all, there'd be a bunch of things that we do. Although that said, I think the key Stoicism, the first book I wrote on Stoicism, I decided to try and list all the techniques that the Stoics mention, and there were approximately 18, right? So there's a reasonable number of them. It's a large toolbox. However, if you want to train people, you're probably going to want to select a smaller number to really focus on. Because if you want people to develop habits and skills and confidence in using those skills, that's the key. In order to do that, you need to teach them a smaller set of skills. 18's too many, basically. So if you pick out what's fundamental in Stoicism, I think mindfulness has to be part of it. It provides a kind of framework and a way for doing everything else. If you can remain mindful throughout the day, then that allows you to notice bad habits and to notice opportunities for good habits. It's kind of a catalyst in a way for, or a prerequisite for doing other therapy stuff, arguably. So Stoic mindfulness, I think, would definitely be an integral part of it. And in some ways, that's just helping people to cultivate it. But what are you mindful of? So some Buddhist practices might involve mindfulness of walking or mindfulness of breathing. There's nothing like that in Stoicism. Because for the Stoics, you may argue this is the point of Buddhism. But for the Stoics, it's very explicit that mindfulness is focused on our thinking and on actually a particular aspect of our thinking. What the Stoics are really interested in are our value judgments from moment to moment, when we think that something is good or when we think that something is bad, when we think that something is harmful or helpful, and how those relate to our emotions. So Stoics mindfulness would be really about closely observing from moment to moment, continuously, the interaction between our thoughts and feelings, which is something that we do in cognitive therapy anyway. And, another aspect to that helps it, a Stoic practice that's mentioned by several authors, would be reviewing at the end of the day how we got on, how we could do things differently the following day. So an end-of-day review can help people to heighten their self-consciousness or self-awareness throughout the day. And then another important aspect would be, there's a concept in modern therapy that we call cognitive distancing. So we have to use jargon for it because it's not a familiar idea to most people, but it's integral to cognitive therapy. There's a lot of research evidence showing its efficacy. It's closely related to mindfulness, and it's very explicit in Stoicism. And so cognitive distancing is the ability to separate our thoughts, beliefs, or opinions from the external things to which they refer. So normally if I see somebody and I think that the guy's a jerk, I just see a jerk, right? I just look at that guy and I think, that guy over there's a jerk. I'm looking at a jerk, right? Yeah. But if I was a Stoic, I might think, I'm looking at a guy and telling myself he's a jerk, right? It's a value judgment, or an opinion that I'm kind of projecting onto him. That comes from me. And Aaron Beck, the founder of cognitive therapy, compares it to wearing coloured glasses. He said, imagine you're wearing blue lenses on glasses. And so everything looks blue. That's a blue house. It's a blue person. It's a blue cat, blue dog. The sky's blue. Everything's blue. And after a while, you forget you're wearing them. So you forget that you're looking through blue glass, and you just assume that the world is blue. It's objectively blue. And then one day someone knocks them off, and you suddenly realize, you're reminded, you go, oh, the world is all different colours. And it's the glass that's blue. Now imagine you were looking at the world through catastrophic coloured glasses, or hopelessness coloured glasses.
Oh, I don't need to imagine, but go on.
To make it more relevant to psychotherapy. Yeah. And then someone knocked those off and gave you a different set of glasses. And you might think, well, the world isn't intrinsically hopeless or catastrophic. Those are perspectives that we can adopt. They're value judgments. It's kind of subjective. Other people, so I might view something as catastrophic. I might lose my job and I think it's catastrophic. Someone else might look at it and think, buddy, it's the best thing that ever happened to you. Or they might think, it's bad, but it's not the end of the world. I myself, 5 years from now, might look back on the time I lost my job and think it was bad, but not the end of the world. Or I might think, wow, turns out actually that was the best thing, paradoxically, that ever happened to me. So thinking about how other people's perspectives, or even my own perspective, could be different allows me to realize that there are blue colored glasses, pink glasses, red glasses, green glasses. And that gives me what we sometimes call cognitive flexibility, which many people believe now is one of the keys to mental health. So training would be helping people to generate alternative perspectives on events, to realize that if I think the world is blue, this is catastrophic. We call that cognitive fusion, because it's like I've taken my opinions and fused them so much with external events that I can't even tell the difference anymore, right? Like I'm confusing my opinions with external events as if there's no separation between the two. So separating those two things is closely related to practicing mindfulness. That's something we should be mindful of, the separation between my value judgments and external events. And that, I think, is really fundamental.
In the book, I mean, you capture events that Marcus Aurelius could have wallowed in or reacted poorly to or reacted differently to, both macro-sized things like the plague, like the Civil War, as well as the death of his child, and showed at least how he represented, how he responded to those things, in terms of not letting it devour him, I suppose.
There are many examples in his life. I mean, he had a very difficult life.
Yeah.
So one of the other techniques we could use actually in Stoicism is modeling character strengths, coping styles, virtues that we see in other people. And, we're writing about Marcus Aurelius, it's just one example, but, you could pick one of your best friends, you could pick a fictional character to model character strengths from. But in Stoicism, we have Marcus Aurelius as a potential role model because we know so much about the guy, because he was famous. There are many ancient philosophers that we don't know that much about. But because Marcus Aurelius happened to be a Roman emperor, we know a lot about his life. We have statues of him. I mean, there are many ancient philosophers we don't even know what the guys looked like. So aren't there statues of them? But we know exactly what Marcus Aurelius looked like at different stages in his life. We have biographies of his life, records of his legislation, a cache of his private letters. So it makes it easier to kind of envisage him and explore his character and his life as a potential role model. And luckily for us, unluckily for him, if you like, as soon as he took the throne, he was beset with one disaster after another. There was a plague, there was a flood, there was a famine, there were earthquakes, there was a civil war, Parthia invaded, the Germanic tribes invaded. And even the Roman historians say it was kind of almost as if the gods decided they were going to test this guy's stoicism out by throwing everything at him. And so he gives us a good example of somebody who manages to cope. And, I call my book How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. People might say, well, how on earth would we know how a Roman emperor thought? Well, it's easy, because he wrote down all of his thoughts. in a book called The Meditations. He literally transcribed exactly how he was thinking about various challenges and forms of adversity that he faced. So we have an amazing window into this man's soul that's particularly focused on how he coped with loss, danger, desire, and other emotional challenges.
Do you think he intended the Meditations to be public? You mentioned in the book that probably not,
No.
but no, it just meant as a private journal, or private notebooks to remind him.
No, we can dig into that, and it makes it for a good blog article, because we can't, with many things in ancient history, of course, we have to qualify it by saying, we can't be certain, but probably not, because for two reasons. There aren't references to it circulating as a text until centuries later. And so maybe it was kind of circulated in private by his family or his friends. The internal evidence suggests it wasn't intended for publication, mainly because he often says things that would be very cryptic. For instance, he says, "Remember that letter that Junius Rusticus, your teacher, sent to your mum? Now, that means nothing to me or you, right? Yeah. It's only meaningful to whoever's read that letter, which is his mum, Junius Rusticus, and himself." He says, "Do you remember the way that your adoptive father, Antoninus Pius, spoke to that toll collector on the road? That doesn't mean anything to anybody, presumably except to the two people involved." So there's that. And then there's also things where he seems to say controversial stuff, which also isn't conclusive, but it suggests maybe it wasn't intended for publication. And then there's also something that's maybe a little less obvious to modern readers, which is, I believe educated Romans had a vastly more sophisticated understanding of rhetoric than most people do today. And Marcus in particular had trained very extensively in Greek and Latin rhetoric. And one of numerous things that people would do deliberately in ancient literature is to criticize someone by implication or by omission. And in Roman culture, this is particularly common. Now, in Book 1 of the Meditations, Marcus names about 17 people that he considers the most important role models in his life. And he mentions at great length his adoptive father, the Emperor Antoninus Pius. But he says nothing about the Emperor Hadrian, who is his adoptive grandfather, and the one who originally selected him to become appointed Caesar. Marcus lived in Hadrian's house for several months towards the end of his life in his villa, but he says nothing positive about Hadrian, although he mentions him 3 or 4 times later in the book as an example of someone who, though being very powerful and wealthy, is now dust, and is a contemplation of mortality and transience. But he doesn't say anything about admiring Hadrian. And that might seem trivial to us, but to Romans it would have seemed controversial. Yeah. They would have said, "Wow, he doesn't have anything nice to say about Hadrian. Did he hate the guy or something?" Or like, that's a sick burn, as the kids say today.
Rhetorical ghosting.
There's another irony about that. Yeah. I mentioned briefly, like, the most famous sophist of the period was a guy called Herodes Atticus, who, if you go to Greece today, there are a number of buildings that still exist that Herodes, he was a wealthy philanthropist and a famous orator or sophist. And he was a family friend of Marcus. And Marcus knew him throughout his whole life. And he was Marcus's Greek rhetoric tutor. But Marcus, he was the most acclaimed intellectual of the era. And family friend, personal tutor. Marcus doesn't mention him anywhere. And if anything, there's a couple of places where, by implication, he seems to slight him. And so it would be amazing that he mentions all these other tutors and then leaves this guy out. That would have been shocking. And even more, he mentions a tutor that he had as a small child, a kind of nanny tutor who was a man and probably a slave or former slave in his grandfather's household. But Marcus doesn't seem to be able to remember this guy's name. So to be fair, it would have been over 50 years ago, right, when he's writing about it.
Sure.
And he says, this guy taught me some really profound moral lessons that remained with me for the rest of my life, this unnamed Trophaeus or tutor. So it would have shocked people that Marcus said, yeah, that guy whose name I can't remember, a lowly slave, had a profound impact on my moral character. But, oh, yeah, Herodes Atticus, I didn't really take anything from that guy.
I did like that you included...
I don't think he would have published that.
No, but his reconciliation with Herodes that you include near the end of the book, I thought was touching. In terms
they made up towards the end.
Yeah, giving the human element, or for someone who is facing death as much as Aurelius was in such poor health all those years, that sense of making it up to someone who clearly was important. This all goes to...
I make an observation about Marcus.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, just to respond to something that you just mentioned, one of the things that's peculiar about Marcus, and it might not be something that people immediately think of, but compared to us today, Marcus Aurelius, having written about him at length and spent a long time really trying to visualize his life, Marcus Aurelius, I think, was a guy who for much of his life woke up every morning and pinched himself and was surprised that he was still alive. He was really surrounded by death. Roman emperors were quite frequently poisoned or assassinated. A few people dropped dead around him mysteriously. Certainly during Hadrian's time, there were people dying left, right, and centre as part of political purges. There was the plague. He had chronic illness. And then he faced these wars in which some of his friends and senior military officers were killed. So absolutely. And then he faced a civil war. So really throughout Marcus's life, I think, for much of it anyway, he sensed that his life was in jeopardy on multiple levels. And I think that changes you. It would be like maybe someone doing a dangerous job or serving in the armed forces. It has an effect on how you view life and how you view your own mortality. Death has become a friend to Marcus Aurelius. Death is a constant companion to Marcus Aurelius. And also he lost 7 out of 14 children. Yeah. So he was bereaved repeatedly. It's no surprise, therefore, that Stoic contemplation of death seems to be very prominent in the Meditations. And this guy's an expert on coming to terms with mortality and loss.
And again, this is a story I've told on the show a bunch, so I apologize to listeners who've had to go through this before. But when I had my leukemia diagnosis about 2.5 years ago, I had a 10-day period from the, hey, Gil, you need to go make an appointment at this cancer clinic, to actually getting really great news that it was essentially minor, non-aggressive, etc. Of course, during those 10 days, I assumed I would be dead within 6 months. And that put me in the life assessment, what have I done, what is left when I'm gone, etc., which is how I ended up rereading the Meditations just around that time. I thought it was arch to bring them with me to the oncologist waiting room, and then discovered, much like Auschwitz, there's no poetry here. You just all sit and look down and don't make eye contact when you're all people who are there with cancer. But there was that sense of... I don't want to say intuitively, but, it seemed that my response to the possibility that I only had a few months left to live was okay. Not a sense of rage, or not a, ready to die sort of thing, and certainly not ready for the suffering that would have been part of that dying. But a sense of, okay, this was the life I had. This is what I did with it. These are things that will last beyond me. This is how I helped change other people's lives and how they changed mine. And that's why, again, intuitively, my first response was, I should probably reread the Meditations, because I think I'm going along that same mental path. But, at the time I was in a state of I don't want to say great confusion, just overwrought, but, was willing to calm myself and look at what it meant, I suppose, in that moment. I'm sort of prattling, but it's something that...
Well, I was going to ask you what might seem like a bit of a random question. Do you like dad rock?
Dad rock?
Classic rock and...
Oh yeah. No, I'm 53 years old and raised on.
Who doesn't like dad rock?
Yeah, no, I was going to go with like contemporary dad rock, like the National.
I'm going to recommend a documentary to you.
Yeah,
called "The Ecstasy of Wilko Johnson," and it's about a guitarist in a British pub rock, bluesy, punky band called Dr. Feelgood. That were a kind of seminal band in the 70s. Now, Wilko Johnson's a very unique kind of guitar legend, but he used to be an English teacher in high school in England. So he's a bit of a nerd about Shakespeare and Milton, who are infused with Stoic influences, incidentally. He likes to quote these things. He's also really into astronomy, and so looking at the stars and picturing himself and from the view from above and so on. And Wilko had pancreatic cancer. And the doctors told him, I think they just gave him a few months to live. So he had to come to terms with his own mortality. And the documentary follows him coming to terms through his love of literature and music with his own mortality. And it's beautifully made. I think it's Julian Temple that made it. But ironically, he was performing on stage and he had this big bulge that he had to kind of hold his guitar around in his abdomen. And there was a guy in the audience who was an oncologist. And Wilko said something about his symptoms. And the guy spoke to him after the gig and said, listen, I think you might have been misdiagnosed, and it may be that your cancer's operable. And he referred him to a guy who was a world expert, and sure enough, they operated on him and removed the tumour. So he was a guy who believed that he was about to die and went through this whole process of reconciling himself to it through his appreciation of classical literature and so on, and then had to come to terms with the fact that he survived. And it's a really good documentary. And he doesn't mention Stoicism anywhere in it, but nevertheless, in a sense, I think it's one of the most Stoic things I've ever seen.
Yeah, embodying it, really as opposed to...
resonates.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. You can tell he would have loved Marcus Aurelius, I think, if he'd read him. But it's also some really good music in it, and it's a very entertaining watch.
I've just put it on my wish list. This is why I do the podcast, by the way. Moments like this and learning this sort of stuff always works for me. For me, it was the choice of either rereading Aurelius or going back and trying to reread all of Montaigne, which I had done 20 years ago and probably would have died before I finished. And so that was an issue too. But yeah, it was that whiplash of I'm going to die in 6 months, and then I walk in and they're like, oh no, you're perfectly fine. This will probably go 30 years before you need treatment. And it was, now I have to go live. Okay. And
yeah,
how do I take those previous 10 days in a positive way into, trying to live versus, turning myself into a wraith in the real world. But yeah, this sounds like something I'm going to really groove on also, between the music and the life story. But what did you talked about, the other types of biography you've done of Aurelius before, but what did this version, I guess, teach you, rendering him in this way, and that, again, sort of, as you mentioned, almost cinematic form? Did it give you a different perspective on him, or just help you sort of unfold him in a different way to a reader?
I think so. Actually, one of the main things that I took from it is, as I've just mentioned, is I really tried to immerse myself in his shoes and kind of visualize his life. That really convinced me that he was a man who had a sense of his own mortality much more pervasively than we might assume. He was forced to come to terms with his own death like on a daily basis, like in a way that would be unfamiliar to most of us. And also just living through the plague. Actually, it's funny when you're writing a history book, you might say, here's a chapter on the Antonine Plague and how horrible it was. And then you move on to the next chapter, right? So there's a tendency when you're writing prose to be a little bit more episodic about things and to compartmentalize them more. Whereas if you were making a movie of Marcus Aurelius' life throughout the last 15 years of it or so, he would be seeing people covered in sores, like funeral pyres burning, dealing with this threat of plague outbreaks. It's an ongoing thing. And I think sometimes when we're writing the prose, we lose, that's the kind of thing that we potentially lose sight of. So really kind of writing the graphic novel and then writing this more narrative biography where I really try and imagine what his life was like, made me realise that the plague was much more prominent in it, probably, than we normally assume. I mean, from the time that the initial outbreak of the plague, it would have, I think, changed the atmosphere at Rome in a sense permanently, or for the rest of his life, things were going to be different because of that. And it was more visible than our pandemic. I mean, one of the strange things about COVID-19 is, and I think one of the problems with it in a way that led to conspiracy theories and arguments and stuff, is people not seeing what actually happens to people dying from the disease, from the illness and so on. Whereas in other plagues throughout history, it's more visible. Marcus would have seen people lining the streets of Rome covered in sores, maybe who lost the use of fingers, maybe who had been blinded, possibly by the plague. So the effects of it would have been more in your face, as it were, and harder to avoid. So I think that would have really had a profound effect on him. And I think also from really, like trying to visualize his life and, understand his character more, it did change my opinion about some of the decisions that he made somewhat. It seems to me now many people argue about the fact that he appointed Commodus as his successor. They think that was a really bad decision. And I'm inclined now to think it was the least worst option, because I think from his perspective, the priority would have been preventing a civil war. That a bad emperor is potentially a better option than the risk of fragmenting the empire in a civil war. And he faced a civil war, but luckily it never really got off the ground. It only lasted for a few months. But temporarily, the Roman Empire for 3 months was split in half in Marcus Aurelius' reign. And, I really think the Senate in particular would have thought that the number one thing is to make sure that doesn't happen. And Commodus might be a bit of a jerk, but at least, he's appointing him is going to give us some stability, ironically, because people aren't going to challenge him. He's Marcus Aurelius' son, and that's going to help hold the empire together. Whereas, I mean, the alternative would have been if Marcus, say, had the most likely candidate would have been Marcus's son-in-law, Pompeianus. And we're told that he was a man who was actually invited to become Caesar 3 times, if I remember rightly, and declined. And so Marcus would probably have appointed Pompeianus, but he married Marcus's daughter, who was an Augusta, an empress. So his son-in-law was the husband of a Roman empress, because she had previously been married to Lucius Verus, who was the co-emperor. If you can wrap around that, these Roman families are a little bit convoluted. But that's how close Pompeianus was to becoming emperor. He was the wife of an empress. And yeah, I think if Marcus had appointed him, it would have caused a civil war, because he came from the equestrian class. So people would have perceived him as being from too humble origins. And they also supposedly saw him as being too foreign because he was Syrian by birth. And I think that would have caused controversy, and other people would have come forward to challenge his appointment, whereas ironically appointing his son was a safer option.
And you do feel he was the last of the good emperors?
Basically, yeah, I think so. Ironically, in a way, I think Augustus set the template for Marcus Aurelius, because Augustus was also a student of Stoicism, the founder of the Roman Empire, somewhat surprisingly. And Augustus wasn't necessarily a model of Stoicism, although Seneca, funnily enough, does think that Augustus is a role model. He thinks that Augustus was initially a very angry and aggressive, violent ruler. He had political purges. But Seneca believes that Augustus conquered his anger through training in Stoicism, and he's a role model in that respect, which is not how we would initially think of him. And so I think Augustus really set this template, and it's only really with Marcus Aurelius that you get an emperor who follows through on this and becomes completely Stoic. Some of the other emperors, like Nero as well, had kind of dabbled in Stoicism, but Marcus commits to it completely. But the seed was planted right in the very foundation of the Roman Empire. But that's the pinnacle. It's the peak, I think, of philosophy in the Roman Empire and politics. And it shaped, I'm sure in many ways it shaped the rest of European history.
Yeah, that's one of those counter histories or counter examples to try to figure out how things could have gone differently if you didn't have the plague, if you had different set of adversaries when the northern frontier starts to melt down. What could have happened that could have extended his rule or changed the way things went. But of course, we've got no control group for that. We've got our single history here.
You could just speculate. Cassius Dio, the historian, who was a senator under Commodus, says that it was a close-run thing that Marcus actually was able to preserve the empire. So we can say easily the empire could have fragmented or been overwhelmed, collapsed during the time of Marcus Aurelius. Certainly, Dio seems to think that. And Dio says we owe him thanks for having preserved Roman civilization and handed it on to subsequent generations.
It's a phenomenal story. You boil him down amazingly, coming in on under 200 pages of actual history, in addition to the notes and everything. I was floored by how full the story really is and how well you support it with the various histories and the documents that we've got without, as you said, putting it into a sort of pedantic or academic mode. So fantastic job. I really appreciate it, Donald. The question I always ask guests, which I should have prepared you for, but I figure you'll probably have some good answers. What are you reading?
Well, I'm reading at the moment. I always think the things that I'm reading are kind of boring. Like, people send me loads of books to read, and I have a big pile of them that I haven't read, like new books by new authors. Most of the time I'm reading classics. Yeah. At the moment, I'm rereading the same old thing. So I'm reading Thucydides, I'm reading Xenophon, the Memorabilia Socratis. I'm reading Plutarch's Life of Alcibiades, and that's because I'm finishing work on a book. I'm
going to have you back on for this one because I've got some Plutarch questions. Trust me. So.
Oh, that'd be cool. He's the template for writing this kind of biography in a way. Plutarch thought that the reason for writing lives or biographies was as a form of edification, to improve people morally. It's a form of, biography is a form of self-improvement for Plutarch.
Yeah.
And so I take inspiration from that in the way that I try to approach it. Like it's been a while since I think the most recent modern book that I've read is my friend Massimo Paolucci's book on Socrates and Alcibiades, which is called, what's it called again? It's called something like Socrates and the Pursuit of Character or something like that. I can't remember the title, but it's Massimo's book about Socrates is the most recent modern one I've read.
Yeah. Oh, no, I'm good with people citing a lot of classics, too. That's fine. Oh, yeah, the Quest for Character, what the story of Socrates and Alcibiades teaches us. Okay. I'll make a note of that in the episode notes. Now, for me, and we'll talk about it next time we talk, but there is a relatively obscure life in Plutarch that absolutely captivates me. Timoleon, who I nobody remembers when I bring it up, but is something that could be adapted into a screenplay very, very easily. B, the comparison of Timoleon with the other later figure, the Roman figure, he comes up wanting, and everything he comes up wanting for is what would make him more appealing to a modern audience. All of the self-doubt and other issues that Timoleon goes through before his triumph are all things that, we would actually find that redeeming, as opposed to this was a sign of weakness, which is how Plutarch contrasts him with the other tyrant-busting figure in the Lives. But I figure we'll save that for the next time you and I sit down, because this is something I have strong opinions about and really want to hear from somebody else on, too. So
that'd be great. I look forward to it.
Cool. Donald, thanks so much for coming on. I appreciate it. I appreciate your helping me, as I've said, in the last couple of years, Stoicism in the capital S sense and Aurelius have meant a different thing to me than they did when I was a younger reader and a younger thinker. So thank you for this book, and thank you for coming on. And like I say, I hope we get to sit down again sometime, and maybe even in person up in Montreal.
That'd be fantastic. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And that was Donald J. Robertson. His new book is Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic Emperor, out now from Yale University Press. I enjoyed the heck out of it, and I suspect the meditations will be back in my reading list this summer. I just, won't bring it into my next oncology check-in. But you should check that book out, along with Aurelius's own writing. And you should see about Donald's writing and his podcast, Stoicism, Philosophy as a Way of Life, and other interviews he's done about Stoicism and cognitive behavioral therapy. Some really interesting stuff. His website is donaldrobertson.name, which is exactly as it sounds. He's on Twitter as Don J. Robertson, all one word. Instagram as Donald J. Robertson. And he has a Substack at donaldrobertson.substack.com. Oh, and he's on Facebook at donrobertson.uk. Like I said, there's some interesting stuff there. Not just philosophy, not just therapy, but, the interesting integration of all that. Now, you can support the Virtual Memory Show by telling other people about it. Let them know there's this podcast comes out every week, even when the host is knocked out by muscle relaxants. And he interviews interesting cultural figures and fascinating people. You can also help out the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it, and who you'd like to hear me record with, or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or art installation or piece of theater or whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. You can do that by sending me a letter, send a postcard. I love postcards. I send out a postcard every day. You can send an email. You can also leave a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. Go longer than that, you'll get cut off, so call back and leave a second message. And let me know if it'd be okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something interesting to share with the listeners, but I'd never run something like that without the speaker's approval. So let me know. Now, if you got money to spare, don't give it to me. I mean, I always appreciate it, and it's a nice gesture when people want to, donate to the cause and all that. But there are other people and institutions who are really in a lot greater need than I am. So, when it comes to individuals, you can go through like GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, Crowdfunder, and other crowdfunding platforms like that, where you'll find people who need help with medical bills or rent or car payments or just other, significant needs, like maybe just getting an artistic project off the ground. I mean, the Virtual Memories Show is almost 600 episodes in, so I'm pretty secure in getting this one off the ground. So help other people. When it comes to institutions, I give to my local food bank every month, make occasional contributions to the Poor People's Campaign, targeted election contributions, but I'm a lobbyist, so that's part of my gig. But there are things you can do like freedom funds, election funds, Planned Parenthood, Women's Choice. There's all sorts of things you can do that, if you have a little money, you can help us build a better world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.